They say you can't judge a book by its cover. But in a town as small and parched as ours, the cover is all you have. We judged Henry by his worn-out boots, his quiet nature, and his single, lonely plot of land that barely grew a crop of scrub grass. When he drove his wagon up to the O'Leary farm and came back with the older sister, the one with the limp and the quiet, haunted eyes, the town didn't just talk. They laughed. They laughed loud and long, slapping their knees in the dusty saloon, whispering behind their hands at the Sunday church service. We all saw it as a tragedy, a poor man's final, desperate mistake. We figured we knew the story. It would be a short, unhappy one. We were wrong. We were all so very wrong. We had no idea that a choice could bloom into something beautiful, or that the happiest man in our midst would be the one we had all pitied. This is the story of how I learned to stop laughing and start watching, and of the quiet miracle that unfolded on Henry's patch of cursed earth. It was the smell that hit me first, not the usual smell of dust and sweat that hangs over the town like a tired blanket, but something sharper, more alive. Pine and something floral, maybe wild rose, a scent so out of place it was like a whisper from a different, greener world. It was coming from Henry's wagon as he rolled slowly down Main Street, a stark silhouette against the setting sun. I was on the porch of the general store, trying to mend a harness strap that had snapped on me for the third time that week. My fingers were clumsy, thick with calluses from roping and riding. A rancher's hands aren't meant for fine work. I watched him, this man I'd known my whole life, perched on the wagon seat with a stillness that didn't match the knot of nerves I could see in his shoulders. His hands, resting on his knees, were clenched so tight the knuckles were white. "Henry," I called out, more to break the silence than out of any real need to speak. He jumped, a full-body flinch that made me wince. The horse, an old mare named Betsy who was as gentle as a summer rain, stopped without him even pulling the reins. She knew the way home. "Oh, Sam," he said, his voice a little too high, "evenin'." He never was one for long conversations, Henry, a man of few words and even fewer smiles. But tonight, there was a flush on his sun-baked cheeks, and his eyes were darting around like a spooked rabbit. He was nervous. It was a strange thing to see in a man who'd once stared down a prairie fire without blinking. "Headed home?" I asked, a stupid question, but my mind was on his skittish behavior. Yes, I am. Got some business to attend to." He cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound. He glanced behind him at the canvas-covered back of the wagon, and a strange, soft look passed over his face. He wasn't a wealthy man, Henry. His 40 acres were mostly rocks and stubborn weeds, a testament to the harshness of this land. He tried everything: wheat, corn, even a few fruit trees, but the soil seemed to reject his efforts. He lived alone in a ramshackle cabin that was more patched than built. He was a quiet fixture in our town, a man who seemed to be slowly fatting into the landscape, his spirit as parched as his land. Then came the day he announced he was going courting. The men in the saloon nearly choked on their whiskey. Who would have him? Was the unspoken question that hung in the air. He'd set his sights on the O'Leary farm, where 2 sisters lived with their widowed father, a man whose temper was as foul as the swamp he lived near. The younger sister, Mary, was a beauty. She had hair like spun gold and a laugh that could charm the birds from the trees. She was the one everyone expected Henry to pursue. A man in his position, they all said, would be lucky to catch a glimpse of her. But Henry came back with Rose, the older sister, the one who never smiled. I'd seen Rose O'Leary a few times at the town gatherings. She was always on the periphery, her face pale and drawn, her blue eyes holding a sadness so deep it seemed to pull all the light out of the room. She walked with a noticeable limp, the result of a childhood accident that had left her leg twisted. She was quiet, a ghost flitting at the edges of the laughter. She was the last person anyone would have expected Henry to choose. It felt less like a marriage and more like an act of pity, a rescue mission for a man who couldn't afford to be a hero. The wedding had been a quiet affair at the church. I was there mainly out of a sense of obligation to a fellow rancher. The whole town was there, but not out of support. It was for the spectacle. A few of the men chuckled under their breath as the minister, a tired-looking man named Parson Miller, pronounced them man and wife. The laughter was a cold, ugly thing, a snake slithering through the pews. Rose's face was as blank as a sheet of paper, and Henry was a rigid mask of forced composure. It felt more like a funeral than a wedding. The next day, a local rancher, a fat, red-faced man named John Grimes, had a fit of laughter in the saloon. Can you believe it? Henry's gone and married the town's only cripple, a match made in heaven. He'd slapped the bar, tears of mirth streaming down his face. What was he thinking? He needs a woman who can work, who can pull her weight, not some broken doll. The other men had laughed along. I chuckled myself, a weak, shameful thing. It was easier to go along with the joke than to be the one who stood out, to be the one who asked, why? We all thought we had Henry pegged. We saw only his failure, his poverty, his quiet, desperate loneliness. We were blind to the sheer stubbornness of his heart. So there he was, on the wagon, returning from a trip into the next county. He hadn't told anyone where he was going, just that he had business. The town had joked, saying he was probably trying to sell his land, or maybe find a second wife, since the first one was such a poor investment. I watched him from the porch, my curiosity gnawing at me. He didn't drive toward his farm, but toward the small house on the edge of town. It was a sad, leaning thing, a place where the town's schoolteacher, a spinster named Miss Abigail, had lived until she passed. It had been empty for a year, but now there was a light in the window. Henry pulled the wagon to a stop, the old wood groaning in protest. He got down, his movements stiff, and walked to the back of the wagon. The canvas was carefully secured. He began to untie the ropes, his hands shaking. He was a man on the verge of something important. Then the door to the house opened and Rose appeared. She was wearing a simple dress, a pale blue that seemed to glow in the fading light. She smiled, and the world tilted on its axis. It wasn't a normal smile. It was a smile that transformed her face, that chased away the shadows I'd always seen lurking there. It was a smile that was shy, hopeful, and utterly radiant. It was a smile that looked at Henry and saw not a poor, struggling farmer, but her whole world. My hand stilled on the harness strap. I felt a cold knot of shame begin to form in my stomach. The laughter of the men in the saloon suddenly felt like a disgusting, petty thing. Henry reached into the wagon and I heard it again. That new green smell. He brought out an armful of something. It was a plant, a bush, its roots wrapped in a damp burlap sack. It had glossy green leaves and nestled among them, tiny, unopened buds that promised a beautiful flower. I didn't recognize it. It looked like it belonged in a painting of some foreign, lush land. "What is that, Henry?" I asked, my voice sounding small and childish. He turned, startled again, as if he'd forgotten I was there. He looked from me to the plant in his arms, and then to Rose, who was now walking towards us, her limp more pronounced but her face full of that new, beautiful light. "It's for her," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's a lilac bush. She told me once that her ma had one, smelled it in a dream." He cleared his throat again. "I found a man in the next county who grows 'em from cuttings, paid him all I had, worth it though, to see her smile." Rose reached us, her eyes shining. She touched the leaves with a reverence that made my breath catch. It was a gesture of pure, unadulterated love, as delicate as the plant itself. "Oh, Henry," she whispered, her voice trembling, "it's perfect." And right there on the dusty street in front of the nosy storekeeper and me, Henry did something that seemed impossible. He let out a long, shuddering breath, the tension finally leaving his shoulders. He turned to Rose, and he smiled. It was a slow, genuine smile that reached his eyes and lit up his entire weathered face. He looked like a man who'd been holding his breath his whole life and had finally taken a clean, clear lungful of air. They stood there. In the gathering dusk, two people the town had deemed broken and worthless, looking at a bush full of unopened buds as if it were the most priceless treasure in the world. And in that moment, I didn't see a pitiful man and his crippled wife. I saw the start of something, a small, defiant rebellion, a fight against the barrenness that had claimed our entire county. The laughter I'd heard in the saloon that afternoon echoed in my memory, but it had lost its humor. It had become hollow and ugly. Henry hadn't made a mistake. He hadn't taken pity on Rose. He had seen something we all had missed. He had seen a woman with a strength that wasn't defined by a bad leg, and she had seen a man with a heart big enough to cross counties just to find a flower for her. I watched them for a moment longer. Henry gently placed the lilac bush in the wheelbarrow Rose had brought out, and they began to push it towards the house, their heads bent together, talking in low, happy voices. They were a world unto themselves, and the rest of us, the ones who had laughed, were locked out. I went back to my harness, but my hands were still shaking. The shame was a bitter pill to swallow. I had laughed at a man for finding his happiness. I had judged a woman by her limp. I had been the fool, the blind man who sees only the surface. The sun was gone now, and the only light came from the small house. The stars were beginning to prick the darkening sky above the vast plains, and I could see a faint silver glow emanating from the window of their humble home. It was the light of a simple lamp, but it felt like the warmest, brightest thing I'd ever seen. I sat on the porch until the cold forced me inside, but I couldn't shake the image. The lilac bush, Rose's smile, Henry's look of pure, unearned joy. The town had its joke. But Henry and Rose had something else, something far more precious. They had hope. The town, true to its nature, didn't let the matter drop. The initial wave of laughter was replaced by a low, humming current of mockery, a more insidious thing that seeped into every conversation. Henry's lilac bush became the symbol of his folly. "What's he gonna do? Grow flowers for a livin'?" was a common jest. "Maybe he'll start a perfume shop in the middle of the prairie." The men at the saloon would tip their hats with exaggerated politeness when they saw Rose limping down the street, whispering "Mornin', princess," under their breath. It was cruel, and it was constant. John Grimes, the rancher, was the worst. He took a perverse delight in making Henry's life difficult. He'd ride by Henry's property, his horse kicking up dust, and yell out some clever remark. He'd fence off sections of land that had been used as a shared watering hole for generations. It was petty, vindictive behavior that stemmed from a place of deep, ugly insecurity, but it had a real impact. Every barb was a rock thrown at a house made of glass. And Henry's house was made of very thin glass. I tried to keep my distance. My own shame at being complicit in the mockery was a heavy weight. I'd chuckle with the men, but a part of me was watching, waiting to see if the inevitable would happen. I expected the joy I'd seen that first night to fade. I expected the lilac bush to wilt and die. I expected Henry to sink back into his quiet desperation, the new dream crushed by the weight of everyone's low expectations. But that's not what happened. Something else was taking root. A month passed, and I had to ride out past Henry's place to check on a fence line. I was not looking forward to it. I'd managed to avoid the area since the wedding, a cowardly act I was just beginning to acknowledge. As I crested the familiar hill, I was struck by a transformation. The old dry creek bed that ran through his property, a scar on the landscape, was now a small, clear stream. I followed it with my eyes. He had diverted a spring. It was a simple thing, just a couple of old logs and some carefully placed stones, but it had changed the entire character of the land. Where there had been only dust and scrub, there was now a small patch of green grass. He had built a fence around it, a simple affair of rough-hewn posts and barbed wire, but it was a fence that screamed, "This is mine." And there in the middle of it all was the lilac bush. It was thriving. The buds had opened into clusters of fragrant purple blossoms. The entire area smelled like spring, like a promise. It was a fragrant, defiant oasis of life in a sea of brown. I slowed my horse, my curiosity getting the better of my shame. A movement near the house caught my eye. Henry was in the small corral next to the house with a young foal. It was a beautiful little thing, a leggy sorrel with a white star on its forehead. Henry was patiently trying to get a halter on it, his voice a low, soothing murmur. It was a skill I'd never seen him use. Where did he get a foal like that? Then I saw Rose. She was in the garden, a small patch of land she'd tilled near the house. She was on her knees, her hands covered in dirt, carefully planting rows of tiny seeds. Her limp was more noticeable as she pushed herself up, but there was a new energy in her movements. She was humming, a soft, tuneless melody that seemed to drift across the distance. She was planting vegetables, in ground that everyone said was cursed. She saw me staring and gave a small, hesitant wave. I lifted my hand in return, a gesture of greeting that felt both awkward and right. A moment later, Henry, seeing me, ambled over to the fence. He wasn't nervous anymore. There was a steadiness in his gait, a newfound confidence. "Sam," he said, a simple greeting. "Henry," I replied, "your place, it's looking good." He nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Rose has been busy. She has a way with things, a way of seeing what something can be, not just what it is. I see she's got a garden going. The soil is getting better. We've been adding compost, and that spring water is a godsend. She's got a real talent for it. She says we'll have enough beans and carrots to feed the whole town by fall." He said it with a straight face, but there was a twinkle in his eye. It was a statement of defiance, a quiet rebuttal to the jokes about him growing flowers. He was growing something far more important, a life. We talked for a while longer, the conversation easy and natural. He told me about the foal, a horse he'd traded some labor for. He told me about how they were working together, him on the land, her in the house and garden. He spoke about her with a hushed reverence, as if he was still in awe that she was his wife. "She's a good woman, Sam," he said, his voice dropping. "She's got a strength in her that I never knew was possible. She's the one who keeps me going. She tells me the land isn't just dirt and rock, it's potential." I thought about John Grimes, sitting in his big, fancy house, his land giving him a steady but unremarkable income. He had everything we were taught to value: money, land, status. But he was a bitter, unhappy man. Henry had nothing but a piece of cursed earth, a quiet wife, and a lilac bush. Yet looking at him, I knew who was truly rich. I left his property, my head spinning with a new perspective. I looked at my own ranch, a successful venture by most standards. I had good cattle, a sturdy house, and more money than I knew what to do with. But my wife had left me 3 years ago, citing my absence of a soul, and my kids barely spoke to me. I had success, but I was a failure. Henry was a failure by every conventional standard, yet he was a success. Over the next few months, I started to seek out Henry's company. I had to see how it was done. I watched the way he talked to Rose, a quiet respect that was far more profound than any grand gesture. I watched the way she would laugh, a bright, bubbly sound that made me feel young again. I saw the way they worked together, not as two separate people, but as a single, cohesive unit. He'd mend the fence, she'd bring him a cool drink. She'd tend the garden, he'd protect it from the hungry rabbits. They were building something beautiful, brick by brick, seed by seed. The town, of course, still laughed, but the laughter was starting to sound different. It was a little less loud, a little less certain. Some of the women began to visit Rose to ask her about her garden. They'd never have admitted it, but they were curious. They saw her happiness, her contentment, and it made them think. The men would still make jokes, but there was a nervous edge to them now. John Grimes saw what was happening, and his bitterness fermented into something darker. He saw Henry's small victories as a direct insult to his own authority. One day, I found Henry and Rose by their lilac bush, which was now taller than me and covered in a cascade of purple blooms. Henry had his arm around her shoulder, and she was leaning into him. They looked like the centerpiece of a painting, a portrait of simple, enduring love. "We're gonna have a baby, Sam," Henry said, his voice breaking with emotion. He didn't even look at me, just stared at Rose, his eyes filled with a kind of awestruck wonder. Rose's cheeks flushed, and she placed a hand on her belly, which had the slightest, barely noticeable swell. She looked at me, her eyes shining. There was no sadness in them anymore, no trace of the haunted woman I once pitied. She was alive. She was the very heart of this new world they were creating. The news spread through the town like wildfire. and for the first time the laughter completely stopped. The men in the saloon looked at each other, their jokes dying in their throats. It was one thing to mock a childless couple's foolish dreams. It was another thing entirely to mock a family. The old jokes about Rose being unable to pull her weight now sounded monstrous. A baby, a new life, growing on that cursed patch of earth. I saw the change in Grimes that day. He was at the saloon when the news arrived. He didn't say a word. His face went a mottled red, and he slammed his empty glass on the bar. He was a man losing a war he didn't even know he was fighting. Henry was no longer the object of their ridicule. He had become something else, a quiet, terrifying example of what could be achieved with faith and love. The town had laughed at his choice of bride, but they were beginning to realize that the joke was on them. They had mistaken his silence for weakness, his poverty for failure. They had completely missed the point. The laughter of the town had been a low, persistent hum for so long that its sudden absence was almost deafening. The silence was a strange, new thing, a vacuum filled with unease and a dawning, unwelcome truth. John Grimes, however, was not a man to admit defeat. The quiet was an open wound, and he picked at it relentlessly. His attacks on Henry became more personal. He would let his cattle wander onto Henry's newly fertile land, trampling the young vegetable shoots. He petitioned the town council to revoke Henry's water rights, claiming the spring was on a tributary that fed his own land. His was a war of attrition, a slow, grinding effort to crush the man who, by simply existing, was proving him and all of his values to be a lie. Henry, for his part, remained remarkably calm. The mocking had built a layer of scar tissue over his soul. He stopped caring about what the town thought, his world having shrunk to the size of his front yard and the woman and child within it. He began to fight back, not with angry words or threats, but with sheer persistence. He patrolled his land at night, sleeping in the barn to scare off Grimes's cattle. He dug a deeper channel for the spring, ensuring a steady flow. He did not complain. He did not whine. He simply worked harder, becoming a determined stone in the path of Grimes's destructive tide. The town, which had so eagerly joined in the mockery, was now divided. Some, like myself, had undergone a quiet change of heart. We saw the unfairness of Grimes's tactics, and our shame began to curdle into a quiet, impotent anger. Others, still loyal to Grimes, saw a man defending his property. The laughter was gone, replaced by a tense, uncomfortable silence. Then the fever hit. It was a summer sickness, a vicious thing that spread like wildfire through the county. It started with a cough, a headache, and quickly progressed to a burning fever. Children were the hardest hit. The town's single, overworked doctor, a man named Prescott, was run ragged, his own health failing from the sheer strain of it. People were dying. The first to go was the banker's youngest daughter, then the blacksmith's apprentice. The little church, normally a place of quiet reflection, became a house of mourning. The fear was a palpable thing, a dark cloud that settled over us all. A week into the fever, Grimes's own daughter, a sullen girl of about 10, fell ill. The irony was not lost on any of us. The man who had tried to poison Henry's life, who had tried to starve his land, now watched his own child's life hang in the balance. Prescott, exhausted and out of his depth, could do little more than prescribe bed rest and prayer. I rode out to Henry's place, more for the comfort of seeing their normalcy than for any real business. But the farm was not normal. Rose was in the garden on her knees, frantically pulling up herbs. Her hands were moving with a frantic energy, her face pale with worry. Henry was trying to soothe her. "The doctor, he's got no help," she was saying, her voice high and strained. "He's run out of medicine. People are dying. I have to do something. I have to." She was packing a basket full of an array of herbs. Thyme, mint, a plant I recognized as echinacea, and a few others I didn't know. She was a healer. It was a skill she'd inherited from her mother, a secret she'd kept hidden, fearing the judgment of a town that saw her only as a cripple. She was far more than that. "You can't just go in there, Rose," Henry said, his voice quiet but firm. "You don't know what it is." "I know what my mother taught me," she shot back, a fire in her eyes I had never seen before. "I know which plants can break a fever, which ones can soothe a cough. Do you think I care about what they think of me? I have a baby to think of, Henry. I will not let my child grow up in a town full of fear and death." There was a moment of silence. Henry looked at her, at the fierce, unyielding love in her eyes, and his own gaze softened. It was the moment the student surpassed the teacher. He was her protector, but she was the soul of the house, and her soul was ordering her to act. "I'll get the wagon," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We're going into town." I rode with them, more out of a sense of duty than anything else. I was a witness to what was about to happen. As we entered the town, we were met with suspicious stares. People remembered the jokes they had made. They remembered how they had treated her. They were embarrassed, and their embarrassment made them hostile. They went to the Grimes house first. John Grimes himself stood in the doorway, a thunderous look on his face. "What are you doing here?" he snapped. "You're not welcome." "I'm here to help your daughter," Rose said, her voice as steady as a rock. "I've brought remedies that might break the fever. If you want your girl to live, you'll let me in." The men behind Grimes muttered. They were afraid. The doctor was useless. This woman, the one they had all mocked, was offering the only hope they had. Grimes stood there, blocking the door, his ego warring with his desperation. Then a small, weak voice called out from inside the house, "Papa." Grimes's face crumpled. He stepped aside, his shoulders slumping. He had lost, not to Henry, but to the raw, undeniable need of a father to save his child. Rose went inside, her basket in hand. The gathered crowd of townsfolk watched, their faces a mixture of guilt and desperate hope. I saw Henry standing by the wagon, his arms crossed. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't looking at Grimes with contempt. He was just watching his wife, a quiet pride in his eyes that was worth more than any victory. An hour passed. Then two. The crowd swelled, the news spreading. Finally, the door opened and Rose emerged. Her face was pale, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, but there was a quiet triumph in her eyes. "The fever has broken," she announced. "She's resting, she's going to be fine." A collective sigh of relief swept through the crowd. Women began to cry. Men looked at their boots, unable to meet the eyes of the healer they had once belittled. But Rose wasn't done. She looked at the gathered crowd, her gaze unwavering. "I'll make a remedy for anyone who needs it," she said. "Bring your sick to me. I will not see this town die because of pride." It was the moment of transformation. The outcast had become the savior. The woman who was mocked for her limp had become the only one who could stand. The town that had laughed at her choice for a husband now saw her as their only hope. She spent the next 2 weeks working tirelessly. Henry became her assistant, grinding roots, mixing herbs, administering the remedies. Their tiny farm became the center of a desperate, grateful town. People stopped seeing Rose's limp. They saw only her hands, which worked with a grace and precision that was almost magical. They heard her gentle voice, which soothed the frightened and the sick. They saw her husband, a man who didn't utter a single word of reproach, who just worked alongside his wife, a pillar of unshakable strength. One afternoon, as I was helping carry supplies to their house, John Grimes approached me. He was a changed man, his arrogance gone, replaced by a weary humility. "I want to apologize," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "To Henry, to Rose, I was a fool." I shook my head. "It's not me you need to apologize to, John." He nodded, his eyes glistening. He walked up to Henry, who was mending a fence post. The two men stood there for a long moment, the air thick with the weight of the past. Then Grimes stuck out his hand. Henry looked at it, a flicker of something, a memory of the pain, the loneliness crossing his face. Then he reached out and took it. "It's a good woman you got, Henry," Grimes said, his voice thick. Henry nodded, a small tired smile on his face. "I know." The town was healing in more ways than one. The fever was vanquished, and with it, the ugliness that had festered in our hearts. The laughter had been replaced by a deep, abiding respect. Rose's choice to help, to save the very people who had mocked her, had become the town's greatest shame and its most profound lesson. Henry's choice to love her, to see the queen where everyone else saw a beggar, had become the town's greatest treasure. The autumn after the fever brought a harvest unlike any the county had ever seen. Henry and Rose's garden, once a pathetic patch of dirt, now overflowed with pumpkins, squash, and corn. Their root cellar was a treasure trove of potatoes, carrots, and onions. The lilac bush, which they had tended with such care, had grown into a magnificent tree, its fragrance a constant, gentle presence that seemed to bless the very air. The town, too, had undergone a transformation. The formal mockery was a distant memory, replaced by a quiet, humble reverence. People would travel miles just to see Rose, not as a patient but as a friend. She had become the town's healer, its heart. The old jokes were never spoken aloud again, replaced by whispered stories of her courage and her kindness. The laughter was gone, but a new sound had taken its place, the sound of a community learning to love. Henry and Rose's baby was born in the middle of a crisp November night. I was there, not as a doctor but as a friend. I had been asked to wait outside, my nerves on edge, listening to the soft sounds coming from within the house. The labor was long and difficult, a perilous journey for a woman with a twisted leg, but Rose, in true fashion, was not defeated. When the cry of a newborn infant finally pierced the cold night air, it was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The door swung open, and Henry emerged, his face a mess of tears and pure, unadulterated joy. He was holding a small bundle wrapped in a rough blanket. "It's a boy, Sam," he stammered, his voice breaking. "A son, we have a son." He placed the infant in my arms. I looked down at the tiny, wrinkled face, a face that held a promise of the future. He had his mother's eyes, I thought, a deep, soulful blue. He was a tiny, fragile thing, but he was alive. He was the product of a love that had been forged in the fires of mockery and refined in the crucible of hardship. Rose, exhausted but radiant, was propped up on the bed. She looked at me, her face pale, but her smile was as bright as ever. "What do you think, Sam?" she asked, her voice a weary whisper. "Is he a fighter?" "He's got your spirit," I said, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. "He'll be just fine." The years that followed were a testament to their resilience. Their farm continued to flourish. The quiet, stubborn man and his crippled wife had built an empire not of money, but of life. They were the envy of the county, not for their wealth, but for their contentment. They named the boy Henry Jr., but he was always called Hank. He grew up strong and healthy, his mother's limp becoming just another unique feature of their beautiful family. He had a mischievous grin, his father's quiet determination, and his mother's boundless empathy. The old house, once a symbol of Henry's poverty, was slowly expanded. They added a room for Hank, a spacious kitchen, and a beautiful porch where they would sit together every evening, watching the sun set over the lush, green land. The lilac bush, now a towering sentinel, stood proudly at the corner of the porch, its blossoms a constant reminder of the fragile hope that had started it all. I found myself at their home more and more often. It was a refuge, a place where I could escape the emptiness of my own life. I had spent my years chasing success, and what had I to show for it? A cold house, a failed marriage, and children who were strangers to me. Henry and Rose, however, had found the only treasure that mattered. They had found each other. Their love was not a fairy tale. It was a process, a choice they made every single day. It was the quiet magic of two souls who had decided to see the best in each other, even when the rest of the world saw only the worst. One evening, when the town was preparing for its annual harvest festival, I found myself alone on their porch with Hank, who was now a young man of 16. He was watching his father and mother in the garden, laughing as they attempted to wrangle a particularly stubborn pumpkin. "Do you know the story?" I asked him, a smile playing on my lips, "about how your ma and pa got together?" He turned to me, a thoughtful look on his face. I know people say they felt sorry for each other, that my pa was a failure and my ma was a cripple. I winced. It was the same ugly narrative we had created all those years ago. That's not the real story, I said. The real story is that your pa saw something in your ma that no one else could see. He saw a queen. I looked at Rose, who was laughing as Henry lifted the heavy pumpkin. And your ma, she saw a king. Hank nodded, his eyes moving from his parents to the towering lilac bush. I know, he said. They told me once. They told me that people laughed at them. They said it was the best thing that ever happened to them, because it taught them to only listen to each other. In that moment, the full weight of the lesson hit me. The town, me included, had been wrong. We had laughed at Henry, not because he was a fool, but because we were. We were the ones who were blind. He had seen the treasure, and we had only seen the dirt. The Harvest Festival that year was a celebration of their story as much as it was a celebration of the season. Henry and Rose were the guests of honor. They were given the best spot in the town square to display their magnificent produce. The townsfolk, the same ones who had laughed at their love, now looked upon them with awe. John Grimes, a humble shadow of his former self, walked up to them, a basket of his own finest apples in his hands. "For you, Rose," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "As a thank you for everything." Rose took the basket, her eyes shining. "Thank you, John," she said. "But the thanks go to Henry. He's the one who never gave up on me." Henry, standing beside her, took her hand. The look he gave her said more than any words ever could. It was a look of pure, unadulterated love. A look that had seen her through the darkest of times and had found her waiting on the other side. It was the same look he had given her on the dusty street, the day he brought her the lilac bush. It was the look of a man who had bet everything on love and had won.